Echoes of the Paper Moon by Jer Beale. The moon over Paper Creek was not a perfect sphere, but a complex polyhedral of cream, gray, and blue-colored paper. It was a masterpiece of construction, a celestial body held together by 1,000 intentional folds. Reggie Witherbottom watched it from his porch. Geometric shadows it cast across the town. In Paper Creek, existence was a series of precise, intentional folds. The world, the people, the animals, everything was an origami creation. A sharp edge is a sharp mind, Reggie. Ken called this out from across the driveway, his voice carrying a bright, neighborly cheer. He was already deep into his morning routine, crouched low over his front lawn. With the rhythmic, practiced ease of a seasoned craftsman, Ken was using his thumbnail to sharpen the creases of his rose bushes. He worked with a focused intensity, ensuring each petal was a precise, geometric flick of crimson paper, perfectly aligned. In Paper Creek, existence followed the laws of the crease. It was a world where one didn't simply wake up and slide into the day. Rather, one unfolded. Reggie remembered the slow process of his own morning, smoothing out the sleep creases in his limbs, ensuring he was crisp, presentable, and structurally sound. To be rumpled was to be sluggish. To be folded was to be alive. "You're looking a bit soft around the elbows today, Reggie," Ken noted, standing and brushing a flake of crimson paper from his knee. He didn't say it with judgment, but with the genuine concern of a friend who noticed a loose thread on a favorite sweater. He stepped closer, his movements stiff and precise, like a series of carefully timed hinges. "Did you forget to press your sleeves before bed? A single sloppy fold in the morning can lead to a sagging disposition by noon." Reggie offered a small, sheepish smile and glanced down at his arm. Ken was right. There was a slight, rounded curve near his joint that lacked the authoritative snap of a proper crease. "Just a bit of restlessness," Reggie replied, though his mind was elsewhere. He stepped off the porch, his feet making a dry, rhythmic scritch-scratch sound against the paper pulp sidewalk. As he began his walk toward the center of town, he found himself noticing things he usually ignored. The way the light hit the edges of the buildings, creating thin, blinding lines of white, where the ink hadn't quite reached the fold. He paused beside a weeping willow that guarded the entrance to the town square. The tree was a marvel of engineering, its branches consisting of long, delicate streamers of pale green paper that cascaded toward the ground in elegant, sweeping arcs. Reggie reached out to touch one of the leaves, expecting the usual resistance of high-grade cardstock. Instead, his finger brushed against something unexpectedly fragile. There was a tiny, jagged rip in the center of the leaf. It wasn't a tear caused by wind or wear, but a clean, sudden rupture in the fabric of the object. Reggie leaned in, his curiosity piqued, and peered into the gap. He expected to see a stem or a vein. Instead, there was nothing. The interior was a hollow, blinding white, an empty void that seemed to echo with a silence so profound it made his own paper heart flutter. It was as if the leaf had been printed on one side only, leaving the inside as a blank, unwritten page. Reggie pulled his hand back. He looked around the square, half expecting the other citizens to be staring at the tear, but the town continued its rhythmic folding. A group of women in pleated skirts glided past, their movements as precise as a series of clockwork gears, chatting about the crispness of the morning air. No one noticed the rupture. To them, the world was a finished work, a completed set of instructions that required nothing more than maintenance. He made his way toward the center of town, where the architecture grew more complex and the folds more daring. He was heading for the archives, a sturdy building constructed from thick, corrugated cardboard that smelled faintly of old glue and dust. This was the domain of Akio, the man who knew the history of every crease in Paper Creek. As Reggie entered, the heavy paper door groaned on its hinges, sounding less like wood and more like a giant book being closed. Akio sat behind a desk that was more of a mountain than a piece of furniture, buried under stacks of yellowed blueprints and ancient diagrams of complex polyhedrons. His face was a map of deep, deliberate wrinkles, each one ironed into his skin with a permanence that made him look more like a sculpture than a man. He didn't look up as Reggie approached. Instead, he remained hunched over a magnifying glass, examining a blueprint of a structural support for the town's southern bridge. "I found a tear, Akio," Reggie said, his voice sounding thin in the cavernous room. "In the willow tree. It wasn't just a rip. It was empty. There was nothing inside." Akio stopped moving. The magnifying glass remained hovered over the blueprint, but the stillness that settled over him was absolute, as if he had suddenly become a static image on a page. He slowly lowered the lens, glass clicking softly against the cardboard desk. When he finally looked up, his eyes were narrow, 2 precise ink dots set deep within the pressed valleys of his forehead. "Empty," Akio repeated, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. "A dangerous word, Reggie. We prefer the term unassigned. The willow is a decorative element. It requires no internal structure to maintain its grace. It is a surface-level truth." Reggie leaned over the desk, his curiosity overriding the ingrained instinct to remain poised. "But if the surface is just a shell for nothing, then what are we? Are we just layers of ink and fold, with nothing but white space beneath our skin?" Akio sighed, a sound that caused a small stack of diagrams to flutter. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a heavy, iron-bound ledger, flipping through pages that crackled with age. "Everything has a seam or a fold, Reggie. The beauty of Paper Creek is not in what lies beneath, but in the precision of the arrangement." He closed the book with a definitive thump, sending a cloud of fine paper dust dancing into the shafts of desk lamp light. Reggie left the archives with Akio's warning echoing in his mind, but the advice felt like a heavy press trying to flatten a spirit that had already begun to curl. The more he looked, the more the surface-level truths of the town began to betray themselves. He noticed that the shadows of pedestrians didn't quite align with the angle of the polyhedral moon. They were slightly offset, as if the ink had bled across the sidewalk during a hasty application. He saw a stray dog, a clever construction of cream-colored cardstock, pause to sniff a fire hydrant, only for its nose to flatten momentarily, leaving a small, white smudge on the painted red surface. The itch of doubt shifted from a mental flicker to a physical sensation, a restlessness in his very fibers. By the time he returned to his own quiet street, the precision of the world felt oppressive rather than comforting. He entered his hallway and stopped. There, in the corner where the floral wallpaper met the baseboard, he spotted it. A gap. It was barely a sliver, a place where the pattern of the wall didn't quite meet the grain of the floor. A tiny, inviting flap of reality that had failed. Reggie knelt, his heart drumming against his ribs. He remembered Akio's warning, but the sight of that loose edge was an invitation he couldn't ignore. He reached out with trembling fingers and pinched the heavy paper between his thumb and forefinger. He didn't pull hard, he simply nudged the fold. To his astonishment, the wall didn't tear or resist. It yielded with a soft, satisfying zip sound, like a letter being opened by an eager recipient. As he pulled, a long, sharp crease flattened out, and the room began to stretch. It wasn't a gradual change. The perspective skewed violently. The hallway lengthened into an impossible corridor, the angles of the ceiling sharpening until the room looked like it had been viewed through a distorted lens. The walls began to peel back in great, sweeping ribbons, revealing not a hidden room or a skeletal frame, but more of that blinding, hollow whiteness. The stability of his home, the only constant he had ever known, was unraveling because he had dared to find the seam. "Stop it! For goodness sake, Reggie! Let go!" Ken's voice exploded in the doorway, though it lacked its usual melodic precision. Reggie spun around to find his neighbor standing there, his face a mask of genuine alarm. Ken didn't look angry so much as terrified. As Reggie looked closer, he saw that the structural integrity of Ken's left shoulder had begun to fail. The sharp, crisp line of his suit jacket had softened into a slumped, organic curve, as if the internal fold holding his form together had simply surrendered. "Look at the street, Ken!" Reggie shouted, gesturing wildly toward the open front door. Outside, the neighborhood was tilting at a sickening 45-degree angle. The meticulously pleated rose bushes were sliding across the lawn like spilled confetti, and the sidewalk was buckling upward in great, jagged ridges, resembling a cardboard box that had been stepped on. The very geometry of Paper Creek was collapsing. The houses, once proud monuments to precision, were beginning to sag, their rooflines dipping and their walls bowing outward, as the conceptual glue that held their dimensions together evaporated. "We have to hold it together!" Ken cried, his voice pitching higher as he instinctively tried to pinch the sagging fabric of his own shoulder back into a crease. He reached out to grab Reggie's arm, but as their hands met there was no firm grip, only the soft, yielding friction of two sheets of paper rubbing together. "If we aren't folded, Reggie, what are we? We're just scraps." Reggie didn't answer. He felt a strange, exhilarating liberation from the rigid expectations of the crease. Reggie stepped forward and walked right through the threshold of his dissolving home. He didn't walk so much as slide, sweeping sound like a brush across a canvas. The town square was a scene of geometric chaos. The weeping willow had completely unfurled. People were frozen in various states of collapse. Some had fallen onto their sides, their three-dimensional forms flattening into two-dimensional silhouettes, while others were just gone. The air was filled with the sound of 1,000 slow tears, the rhythmic rip-rip-rip of a world being dismantled by— Reggie looked up and felt a cold spike of awe. The polyhedral moon, the pride of Paper Creek's celestial engineering, was failing. The complex angles that gave it volume were buckling, and the cream and blue panels were sagging inward. It no longer looked like a masterpiece of construction. It looked like a discarded, crumpled napkin hanging in a sky that was rapidly losing its pigment. The deep blue of the firmament was fading into a matte, colorless void, revealing a texture that was too coarse, too grained to be a sky. "It's all just a drawing, isn't it?" Reggie whispered, though there was no one left to answer him. The realization didn't bring fear, but a strange, floating serenity. He began to run, not away from the destruction, but toward the horizon, where the matte blue was peeling away in great, curling strips. With every stride, he felt himself becoming lighter. The weight of his responsibilities, the morning pressing of his sleeves, the social obligation of a crisp posture, simply vanished. He passed the archives, which had collapsed into a heap of corrugated ribs, and saw Akio sitting amidst the ruins. The old man wasn't panicking. He was simply watching his own hands flatten into two-dimensional sketches, a look of profound, exhausted curiosity on his face. As Reggie pushed further, the cobblestones beneath him transitioned from three-dimensional blocks to rough graphite outlines, and then to nothing but gray dust. He reached the absolute perimeter of the town, a place where the world simply stopped. He stood at the edge of a precipice that was not a cliff, but a margin. Behind him lay the crumpled wreckage of Paper Creek, a discarded project of folds and creases. In front of him stretched a vast, blinding whiteness that seemed to vibrate with a humming energy. It smelled of old library books and fresh, wet ink. Reggie looked down at his own hands. The defined creases of his knuckles were gone. He was no longer a man made of folded cardstock. He was a silhouette, a smudge of charcoal and ink, defining a shape against an infinite, blank plane. He felt the terrifying liberty of the flat sheet, the raw potential of a page that had not yet been decided. He was a comma in a sentence that had been erased, waiting for the next word to be written. Then, the sky broke. It didn't crack or shatter. It peeled back with a sound like 1,000 heavy textbooks being opened at once. A light, blinding and artificial, flooded the white void, casting a shadow over Reggie that stretched for miles. He looked up, his ink-stained eyes widening, and saw a face. It was a face of impossible proportions, a landscape of soft skin and wide, curious eyes that could have swallowed the entire horizon of Paper Creek. It was Sora. Sora didn't speak, for a voice of that magnitude would have likely scattered Reggie's ink across the void. Instead, the child leaned in, their breath a warm, rhythmic gale that smelled of peppermint and pencil shavings. To Reggie, it felt like a summer storm, a sweeping wind that threatened to blow his silhouette right off the page. He watched, paralyzed by a mixture of terror and fascination, as a colossal wooden cylinder descended from the heavens. The tip was a dark, shimmering core of lead, a pillar of graphite that dwarfed the ruins of the town behind him. The pencil touched the plane. The impact wasn't a crash, but a resonant, scratching vibration that hummed through Reggie's very essence. Sora began to draw. With a slow, deliberate motion, the lead swept across the whiteness, carving a deep, charcoal line that surged forward like a tidal wave of ink. Reggie felt the pull of the graphite, a magnetic lure that drew him toward the new line. He wasn't being pushed. He was being integrated. As the pencil moved, the line began to curve and loop, creating a sweeping valley that felt more substantial, more real, than any fold he had ever known. The graphite wave surged over him, and for a moment, Reggie felt himself dissolve. He was no longer a silhouette or a smudge. He was a liquid current of charcoal, flowing into the grooves of the new landscape. He felt the scratch of the pencil's lead as it carved out the ribs of a mountain, and the soft, sweeping smudge of a thumb creating the haze of a distant forest. It was an intimate, overwhelming sensation, the feeling of being thought into existence. As the pencil lifted, the world solidified around him. Reggie blinked, and found himself standing on a hillside of deep, velvety green. He looked down at his hands and gasped. He was no longer made of paper, nor was he a flat ink stain. He had volume, but it wasn't the artificial, geometric volume of the folds. His skin had a soft, organic texture, and when he moved his arm, there was no rhythmic scratch, only the quiet, natural rustle of fabric against skin. He felt a warmth in his chest, a steady, rhythmic thrum that felt like a heart, not a structural support. "Reggie?" a voice called out. He spun around to see a figure emerging from a grove of trees that looked like watercolor washes brought to life. It was Ken. His neighbor looked different, softer, his face lacking the severe, ironed lines of his former self. He was wearing a simple linen shirt that draped naturally over his shoulders, without a single sharp crease in sight. Ken looked down at his own sleeves, then back at Reggie, a look of profound wonder crossing his face. He reached out and touched a nearby leaf. It didn't rip, and it wasn't hollow. It bent under his finger and sprang back with a supple, living resilience. "I don't feel crisp," Ken whispered, his voice no longer sounding like parchment, but possessing a rich, resonant depth. He flexed his fingers, watching the skin move and fold in a way that was fluid and unpredictable. He didn't look horrified anymore. He looked like a man who had spent his entire life wearing a suit of armor and had just stepped out of it into a warm breeze. "Reggie, look at the sky. There are no angles. Not one." Reggie looked up. The sky was a swirling masterpiece of cerulean and gold, the colors blending into one another with a seamless, painterly grace. There was no polyhedral moon, no geometric shadows, and no sense of a ceiling. Instead, there was a vast, open expanse that felt as though it went on forever, punctuated by clouds that looked like dollops of whipped cream. For the first time in his existence, Reggie didn't feel the need to check his posture or smooth his sleeves. He felt heavy in a way that was comforting, anchored to the earth by a gravity that felt natural rather than conceptual. "We've been revised," Reggie said, the words tasting fresh in his mouth. He reached down and scooped up a handful of soil. It wasn't graphite dust or shredded pulp. It was cool, damp earth that clung to his fingers. He laughed, a sound that started deep in his chest and echoed across the valley. It was a messy, imprecise sound, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. As they walked together through the watercolor grove, they found others. Akio was there, sitting by a stream that flowed with a liquid clarity that defied the laws of ink. The old man was no longer a map of ironed wrinkles. He looked younger, his face softened, his eyes bright with a childlike curiosity. He was holding a smooth river stone in his hand, turning it over and over, marveling at its irregular, organic shape. "I suppose the irony is that I spent my life cataloging the seams, only to find that the most profound truth is the absence of them," Akio said, his voice now a warm hum that blended with the bubbling of the stream. He tossed the stone back into the water, watching the ripples expand in perfect, organic circles. He looked up at the swirling cerulean sky, a small, contented smile playing on his lips. "We were so afraid of the blank page, Reggie. But it turns out the blank page is the only place where you can actually grow." Ken sat down beside him, leaning back into a patch of grass that felt like velvet. He didn't check for creases in his trousers. He didn't worry about the way his shoulders slumped. He simply existed, a soft-edged man in a soft-edged world. "Do you think the child will come back?" Ken asked, his voice devoid of the old anxiety. "To draw something else? To erase us again?" He felt substantial, an intentional part of a larger, breathing composition. "Maybe," Reggie replied softly. "But for the first time, I think it's all right if the lines change. We aren't just instructions anymore, Ken. We're the art."